The fate of a pharmaceutical giant and the lives of thousands didn't rest on the gleaming chrome pen in Alistair Finch's hand. It didn't depend on the eager nods of the Japanese investors across the mahogany table. It balanced, precariously, on a whisper from a waitress who was meant to be nothing more than a shadow. In the cathedral quiet of the Argent Club's Roosevelt Room, a sanctuary of old money and whispered deals, billionaire Alistair Finch was about to sign away $150 million, the capstone investment for a drug he believed would be his legacy. At the precise moment his pen touched the paper, a voice, soft as felt, but sharp as a scalpel, cut through the reverent silence. "Sir, that's the wrong binding agent." The whisper was a grenade rolled into a prayer meeting. For the young woman who spoke it, it was the end of a job she desperately needed. For Alistair Finch, it was either the ravings of a madwoman or the single most important sentence he had heard in a decade. For Maya, however, it was more than an interjection. It was the sound of her past, buried under 3 years of grief and exhaustion, clawing its way back into the light. And in that room, under the gaze of powerful men, nothing would ever be the same. The Argent Club wasn't a restaurant, it was a fortress. Its burnished wood walls had absorbed more secrets than a confessional. To work there was to accept a vow of invisibility. Maya Reyes, at 22, had mastered the art. Her movements were fluid, her presence negligible, her silence absolute. Tonight, the simple black dress and starched white apron felt like a lead vest. It was a constant, chafing reminder of the life she was supposed to be living versus the one she was enduring. The girl who once aced organic chemistry exams and dreamed of a white coat and a research lab now spent her nights ferrying trays of overpriced steak and refilling the water glasses of men who could buy the university she'd been forced to abandon. Her dark eyes, once bright with the fire of intellectual curiosity, were now perpetually shadowed by fatigue. Double shifts were her reality, a grueling penance paid to the mountain of debt her father's illness had left behind. The uniform was a disguise, hiding the person she used to be. A top-of-her-class, pre-med student at Columbia, a mind that saw the world not as objects, but as a breathtakingly complex dance of molecules and proteins. That life had flatlined 3 years ago. It hadn't been a single phone call, but a slow, agonizing decline. A new, promising heart medication, hailed as a miracle, had turned out to be a nightmare. A subtle, off-target effect, a molecular miscalculation by its creators, had led to catastrophic cardiac scarring. Her father, a vibrant history professor, had been one of its victims. The ensuing legal battle had drained their savings, and his death had shattered her world. She dropped out, trading lecture halls for the relentless grind of the service industry, the only work that paid cash, fast, and asked no questions about the Ivy League-sized hole in her resume. "Reyes, table 4 needs their check. Stop staring into space," hissed Mr. Gable, the restaurant's manager, a man whose soul had been pickled in vinaigrette. He seemed to derive a special, grim pleasure from humbling her. "This is a place of business, not a library for your daydreams." Maya blinked, her face settling into a mask of placid obedience. "Yes, Mr. Gable." She moved through the dining room, a ghost in comfortable shoes. Survival here required more than just carrying plates. It required observation. You learned to read the tightening of a jaw, the subtle shift in posture that meant a deal was going south, the flicker of an eye that signaled a need for another scotch. You became a silent anthropologist of the powerful. Tonight, the air in the Roosevelt Room was different. It wasn't just business. It was electric, with a sense of history being made. It was the club's most exclusive private room, reserved for the kind of men who didn't just run companies, but shaped economies. And tonight's king was Alistair Finch, Maya knew the name. Everyone in New York did. He wasn't a flashy tech mogul. He was old money, a venture capitalist from a bygone era, a man who built his fortune on shrewd, ruthless bets in the biotech and pharmaceutical space. He was known for his legendary due diligence, his impatience with fools, and a personal fortune so vast it was spoken of in terms of national GDPs. Serving his table was like performing brain surgery in a minefield. As she entered with a silver tray of fresh bread, the weight of the meeting settled on her. Finch wasn't alone. With him was the celebrated Dr. Aris Thorne, the lead scientist from a boutique biotech firm called Pharmaxon. Thorne was the polar opposite of Finch. He was slick, media-savvy, with a dazzling smile and an ego that entered the room a full 10 seconds before he did. Across from them sat 2 investors from a Japanese consortium, their faces impassive, their silence more intimidating than any outburst. Maya's mind, the part she fought to keep numb during her shifts, began to connect the dots. Pharmaxon was the talk of the financial world, a small company with a revolutionary new drug. Finch's fund was the final piece of the puzzle, the massive Phase 3 trial funding that would take it to market. This wasn't dinner. This was the birth of a blockbuster drug. She moved around the table, refilling water glasses, her focus absolute. Yet she couldn't block out the words. Allosteric modulation, unprecedented efficacy in clearing amyloid plaques, minimal off-target effects. They were words from her old life, echoes from a world she thought she had lost forever. A sharp, bitter pang of longing tightened her chest. She forced it down, burying it under the immediate, pressing need to get the breadbasket centered just so. She placed the last water glass down, and as she began to retreat, Alistair Finch's voice, a gravelly baritone accustomed to command, stopped her cold. "Waitress." She froze, turning slowly. "Sir." He didn't look at her. His piercing blue eyes were locked on Dr. Thorne. "The wine. I want the 82 Waitress, and I don't want to see you again unless you are holding that bottle." It wasn't just an order, it was a dismissal, a clear, unambiguous statement of her utter irrelevance to the momentous events unfolding. "Of course, sir," she said, her voice a perfect neutral monotone. As she walked from the room, pulling her cloak of invisibility tightly around her, she had no idea that in less than an hour, she would be forced to tear it to shreds, to risk everything she had on the ghost of the woman she used to be. The weight of the tray in her hands was nothing compared to the weight of the knowledge she was about to unearth. The 1982 Chateau Petrus was kept in the deep cellar, a temperature-controlled crypt where legendary vintages slumbered, their value compounding with each passing year. Retrieving it gave Maya a few precious minutes of reprieve from the high-stakes theater upstairs. As she carefully cradled the bottle, she noted its price on the inventory list. $24,000. It was more than she had earned in the past year. The casual, thoughtless decadence of it all, happening just a few floors above her own quiet desperation, was a familiar, acidic taste in her mouth. Returning to the room, she performed the sommelier's ritual with the practiced, detached grace of a surgeon. The presentation of the label, the careful uncorking, the decanting, every movement was flawless. Alistair Finch gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. His attention already snapped back to the conversation. He was a man who seemed carved from granite and skepticism, his mane of silver hair impeccably styled, his face a roadmap of boardroom battles won and lost. He radiated a palpable aura of control, a man so accustomed to being the smartest person in the room that he rarely considered any other possibility. His guest, Dr. Thorne, was a study in contrasts. Where Finch was solid, Thorne was effervescent. He gestured with manicured hands, his voice resonating with the practiced confidence of a man who had given 1,000 TED Talks in his mind. He was a rock star scientist, and tonight was his coronation. But the true power at the table, Maya sensed, was Finch. He listened more than he spoke, his stillness a gravitational force. He absorbed every claim, every data point, his gaze missing nothing. "The mechanism is what makes Cardia 7 so revolutionary, Alistair," Thorne was saying, his voice buttery smooth. "It's not just another beta blocker. We've engineered a molecule that acts as a selective protein kinase inhibitor. It specifically targets and binds to a novel allosteric site on the enzyme, preventing the downstream signaling cascade that leads to cardiac hypertrophy." Maya's ears pricked up. Protein kinase inhibitors, allosteric sites. This was the bleeding edge of pharmacology. It was the exact field of research that had fascinated her, the subject of the honors thesis she never got to write. A phantom limb of her old intellect twitched. The urge to ask about the specific kinase family, about the binding kinetics, was so strong it was a physical ache. She suppressed it, focusing on clearing the soup bowls with silent efficiency. "Your claims are bold, Aris," Finch stated, his voice flat. "Many have tried to target this pathway. The issue has always been specificity. Cardiotoxicity from off-target effects has killed every previous attempt in clinical trials." "And that," Thorne declared, seizing his moment like a seasoned actor, "is our billion-dollar secret." He slid a wafer-thin tablet across the table. With a theatrical tap, he brought up a complex, three-dimensional rendering of a molecule, a beautiful, intricate lattice of atoms, nestled perfectly into the folds of a protein. "Our proprietary synthesis process creates a molecule with a unique stereoisomerism. It fits the allosteric site on the target enzyme like a key in a lock. But more importantly, it's repelled by the active sites of similar, essential kinases in the heart muscle. It's the ultimate magic bullet." To the others, it was an impressive abstract symbol of modern science. To Maya, it was a language she spoke with the fluency of a native. Mr. Ito, the senior Japanese investor, leaned forward, studying the diagram with a quiet intensity. "Your Phase 2 trial data showed remarkable efficacy. What about long-term safety?" "Impeccable," Thorne beamed, his confidence radiating. 10,000 simulated patient years with 0 significant cardiotoxic events. This molecule is as safe as aspirin. This is the key. The entire $150 million valuation for this final stage hinges on this specific, unique molecular structure. Alistair Finch watched the investors, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. He was the master puppeteer, letting his star scientist perform, while he gauged the audience's reaction. He was about to close the deal that would not only net his fund billions, but would also attach his name to a drug that could save millions of lives. It was the legacy he craved. Maya moved to refill Mr. Ito's water glass, her path taking her directly behind Dr. Thorne. For a brief, fateful second, her gaze fell on the glowing screen of the tablet. She saw the elegant twist of the molecule, the color-coded atoms, the specific notation for the bonds. She saw it all. And then she saw it. The error. It wasn't a typo. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible flaw in the stereochemistry. A single chiral center, the point in the molecule that determines its three-dimensional handedness, was inverted. A detail so esoteric, so deep in the weeds of molecular biology, that 100 CEOs and 1,000 lawyers could look at it and see nothing. But to a student who had spent a sleepless semester memorizing the catastrophic effects of the wrong stereoisomer, the thalidomide tragedy was seared into the brain of every pre-med student. It was a screaming, 5-alarm fire. A jolt, cold and sharp, shot through her. Her breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to warp, the confident drone of Dr. Thorne's voice dissolving into a meaningless buzz. All she could see was that glowing screen, the flawed molecule burning itself into her retinas. The structure Thorne was showing them, the magic bullet, wouldn't be repelled by the other essential cardiac kinases. It would bind to them. Not as strongly as the intended target, but enough. Over time, with repeated dosage, the cumulative effect of that off-target binding wouldn't just be ineffective. It would be toxic. It would slowly, insidiously poison the heart muscle itself. It wouldn't just fail to prevent cardiac hypertrophy. It would cause it. Her mind flashed back to a sterile, white hospital room, the rhythmic, labored beep of a heart monitor, the look of confusion and betrayal in her father's eyes as the doctors told him the miracle drug was killing him. The molecule on the screen wasn't the same one that had killed her father, but the mistake was terrifyingly similar. It was the same brand of scientific hubris, the same fatal oversight. This was a disaster in the making, not just a financial disaster for Finch and the investors, but a potential public health catastrophe. Panic and adrenaline warred within her. Her first, overwhelming instinct was to say nothing. "It's not your business. You're a waitress, a college dropout." If she spoke up, she wouldn't just be fired, she'd be humiliated, laughed out of the room. Mr. Gable would have her blacklisted from every restaurant in Manhattan. She could picture the looks of contempt, Dr. Thorne's smug fury, Alistair Finch's icy dismissal. "Keep your head down, finish the shift. Go home." She retreated from the table, her hands trembling so violently she had to grip the water pitcher with both hands. She stood by the mahogany service station, trying to force air into her lungs, but she couldn't tear her eyes from them. She watched Mr. Ato nod slowly, a look of deep satisfaction on his face. He exchanged a glance with his partner. They were sold. "This is most impressive, Thorne-san," Ito said, a rare note of warmth in his voice. "Our team has reviewed the preliminary data. This final piece of the puzzle is conclusive. We are prepared to proceed." He reached into his expensive leather briefcase and produced a thick, leather-bound folder. The contract. The sight of that folder was a physical blow. The finality of it. They were going to sign. They were going to build an empire on a foundation of poison. Maya's conscience, the part of her she thought had died with her father, screamed. This wasn't just about business. It was about truth. It was about the lives of the countless people who would trust this drug. The work she had dedicated her young life to was being perverted by a careless, arrogant man who had either missed the floor or worse, deliberately hidden it to rush to his payday. Her years of study, the sacrifices, her father's memory, it would all be a lie if she stood by and did nothing. Alistair Finch was already reaching for his pen, a magnificent, heavy silver instrument. Mr. Uto opened the folder to the signature page. The room was silent, pregnant with the weight of the moment. Maya's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Every survival instinct she had honed over the past 3 years screamed at her to stay silent, to remain invisible. But the ghost of the scientist she once was, the woman who believed that truth was not optional, refused to be quiet. She had already lost her future once. She had nothing left to lose but a dead-end job. And in that moment, that wasn't enough to trade for her soul. Taking a deep, ragged breath, she pushed off from the wall. She began walking toward the table, each step a rebellion against the life that had been forced on her. She had no plan, no eloquent speech prepared. She only knew she could not let that pen touch that paper. The world shrank to the few yards of plush Persian carpet between her and the table. To the men seated there, her approach was a non-event, the waitress returning to offer coffee. They didn't even look up. Their universe was contained in the crisp pages of the contract and the gleaming nib of Alistair Finch's pen. Maya's mind was a maelstrom. "What are you doing? Turn back! This is professional suicide. He will ruin you." The voice of fear was loud and rational, but beneath it another voice, quieter but harder than steel, spoke with the authority of a textbook. "The enantiomer is cardiotoxic. You know it is." She reached the table, just as Finch uncapped his pen. The soft click echoed in the silent room, like a judge's gavel. Time was up. She defaulted to the only role she was permitted in this room. The deferential servant. Leaning in toward Alistair Finch, she lowered her head, as if to ask about the service, bringing her lips close to his ear. Her movements were a perfect imitation of a well-trained waitress. Finch, visibly annoyed at the interruption at this critical second, began to turn his head, a scowl forming. He expected to hear, "More coffee, sir?" Instead, she spoke 6 words. Her voice was a bare whisper, yet each syllable was loaded with the absolute, unwavering certainty of a physical law. "Sir, that's the wrong binding agent." The whisper was so quiet, only he could have heard it. For a single, stretched-out second, the universe paused. Alistair Finch froze. His pen hovered a millimeter above the signature line. His mind, a finely tuned machine for processing market variables and risk analysis, failed to compute this impossible, alien input. A waitress, a binding agent. The two concepts did not belong in the same reality. He slowly, deliberately, turned his head. His piercing blue eyes, the color of a winter sky, finally focused on her, truly seeing her for the first time. He didn't see a uniform. He saw a young woman, her face pale, her expression a terrifying mixture of desperation and absolute conviction. He saw dark eyes that held a startling, unnerving fire of intelligence. The moment of pure shock quickly curdled into a cold, controlled fury. Who was this girl? What game was she playing? The sheer, unmitigated audacity was breathtaking. "What did you just say?" he breathed back, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Maya didn't flinch. She had jumped off the cliff. There was no climbing back up. "On the tablet," she whispered, her gaze flicking toward the screen that Dr. Thorne was now smugly powering down. "The stereoisomer. The chiral center at the C5 position. It's inverted. It will have off-target affinity for cardiac kinases. It's cardiotoxic." Across the table, Mr. Ito, ever observant, noticed the exchange. He saw Finch's frozen posture, the waitress whispering urgently in his ear, the inexplicable halt to the signing. He raised a single, questioning eyebrow. Dr. Thorne noticed too. A sneer of contempt twisted his lips. He saw a menial servant overstepping her bounds, about to be vaporized by his new billionaire partner. He almost chuckled. Finch's face was a thundercloud. This was his legacy moment, the culmination of a year of negotiations, and some anonymous girl was attempting to sabotage it with what sounded like scientific gibberish. A surge of pure, unadulterated rage washed over him. His entire being screamed at him to have her thrown out, to make an example of her that would be spoken of in service industry circles for years. He opened his mouth to utter the 2 words that would end her employment and her evening. "Get out!" But something stopped him. It was the words she had used. Stereoisomer, chiral center, off-target affinity. They weren't the words of a lunatic. They were precise, technical, and terrifyingly specific. It wasn't malice or madness in her eyes. It was certainty. A terrifying, absolute certainty that he, in his long and storied career, had only ever seen in the eyes of Nobel laureates and the most brilliant researchers he had ever funded, and it was coming from a waitress in a black dress. The cognitive dissonance was so profound it created a sliver of doubt, a hairline crack in the foundation of his fury. But it was a very, very small crack. Alistair Finch's rage, held in check for a brief, bewildering moment, finally erupted. It wasn't a shout. He was far too disciplined for such a vulgar display. It was a cold, focused implosion of fury. He pulled back from Maya, his eyes turning to chips of ice. "Get out!" he hissed, the two words laced with enough venom to corrode steel. He didn't raise his voice, but the command carried the absolute authority of a man who had never been disobeyed in his adult life. It was an order of social and professional execution. Dr. Thorne's smirk widened into a triumphant grin. He leaned back in his chair, ready to savor the show. Mr. Ito watched the scene unfold with the detached curiosity of a biologist observing an insect. Maya's blood ran cold. The dismissal hit her like a physical blow. This was it. The moment she had feared. She had failed. She had gambled everything and lost in the space of 5 seconds. Humiliation washed over her, hot and suffocating. But as she straightened up, pulling away from the table, her eyes met Dr. Thorne's. She saw the undisguised pleasure on his face, the look of a man who enjoyed seeing others crushed beneath his heel. And in that instant, her fear was consumed by a different kind of fire. It wasn't just about the science anymore. It was about the arrogance, the carelessness of men like Thorne, who could ruin lives and companies with their incompetence and never face the consequences. She couldn't leave. Not like this. Ignoring Finch's order, she reached for the pristine white linen napkin by her assigned serving station. With a swift, practiced motion, she snatched a pen from her apron pocket, a cheap ballpoint she used for taking orders. As Finch turned to Mr. Ito, a forced, brittle smile on his face to smooth over the disruption. "My apologies. A minor staff issue." Maya acted. On the clean surface of the napkin, her hand moved with a speed and precision that belied her trembling. She didn't write words. She wrote the language of her former life. She scribbled the corrected chemical structure for the Cardia 7 molecule, showing the proper 3D orientation of the atoms at the C5 chiral center. Beneath it, she drew a quick, dirty diagram of the flawed molecule binding imperfectly to a non-target cardiac enzyme, and beside that she wrote 3 cryptic, damning words. Check Hurge channel affinity. It was a test, a specific, verifiable instruction, a direct challenge to Thorne's data. She strode back to the table. The men watched, stunned into silence by her sheer audacity. She didn't say a word. She simply placed the napkin on the table, directly in Alistair Finch's line of sight, next to the open contract. Then she turned and walked out of the Roosevelt room, her back straight, her head held high. She didn't run. She didn't look back. She walked with the quiet dignity of someone who had said what needed to be said and was prepared for whatever came next. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, the spell was broken. "Unbelievable!" Dr. Thorne spluttered, his face crimson with indignation. "Alistair, I am so sorry. I'll have security deal with her immediately. She's clearly unstable." But Alistair Finch wasn't listening. His gaze was riveted to the napkin, on the frantic yet precise scrawl of a molecular diagram, a diagram that was subtly, yet fundamentally, different from the one in his multi-million-dollar presentation. Check Hurge channel affinity. The words echoed in his memory. The Hurge potassium channel was the third rail of cardiac drug development. Unintended binding to it was a known catastrophic cause of drug-induced arrhythmia. It was the first thing any competent development team would screen for. Mr. Ito leaned forward, his curiosity now fully engaged. The disruption was no longer a minor staff issue. It was a variable, an unknown that had been injected into a meticulously calculated equation. And Mr. Ito did not invest in unknowns. "Finch-san," he said, his voice calm but firm, his eyes on the napkin. "Perhaps you should look at what she wrote." The deal was no longer moving forward. The pen was capped. The contract lay unsigned. The entire $150 million venture now teetered on the edge of a precipice, its fate resting on the scribbles on a piece of linen. The atmosphere in the Roosevelt room had been irrevocably shattered. The smooth, celebratory momentum was gone, replaced by a tense, awkward silence. Dr. Thorne was fuming, Mr. Ito was observing, and Alistair Finch was staring at the napkin as if it were a coded message from another world. "Alistair, this is preposterous," Thorne insisted, his voice rising in panic. "Are we really going to let some hysterical waitress derail the most important pharmaceutical deal of the decade? I'm calling security." "Shut up, Aris," Finch said, without looking up. His voice was dangerously quiet. The seed of doubt the waitress had planted with her eyes had been watered by the ink on the napkin. Check Herg channel affinity. It wasn't the rambling of a madwoman. It was a specific, testable hypothesis. Alistair Finch was a billionaire, not just because he was ruthless, but because he was pathologically paranoid about details. He trusted his gut, and his gut had saved him from ruin more times than his army of analysts. Right now, his gut was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. He had built his empire by questioning every assumption, especially when things seemed too good to be true. And Thorne's performance tonight, in retrospect, had been just a little too polished, a little too perfect. He picked up the napkin. He looked at the corrected diagram, then glanced at Thorne. "Aris, show me the raw data from the Herg channel assay." Thorne paled slightly. The raw data, Alistair. It's all summarized in the FDA submission packet. It's clean. We passed with flying colors. "That's not what I asked," Finch said, his eyes narrowing. "I want to see the chromatograms, the raw output files." "Now." Mr. Ito watched this exchange, his impassive face giving nothing away, but he subtly pushed the contract folder back towards the center of the table. The signing was officially on hold. They're on my secure server at the lab," Thorne stammered, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. "I can have my assistant send them, but it will take some time." "Don't bother." Finch stood up abruptly. "Gentlemen, please excuse us for a moment. An internal matter requires my immediate attention." He grabbed Dr. Thorne by the arm, his grip surprisingly strong for a man in his late 60s. "You? With me." He all but dragged his star scientist out of the dining room and into an adjacent study, a small, soundproofed room paneled in dark oak. He closed the door firmly, shutting them in. The room felt like an interrogation chamber. "Don't you dare lie to me, Aris," Finch said, his voice a low growl. He released Thorne's arm, and the scientist stumbled back. "Did you review the Herg data yourself, or did you let your postdocs handle it?" "I supervised the entire process," Thorne insisted, his bravado crumbling. "The data is solid." Finch ignored him. He pulled out his own encrypted laptop from his briefcase and set it on a leather-topped desk. His fingers, surprisingly nimble, flew across the keyboard. As part of his due diligence, he had been granted top-level access to Pharmaxon's servers. He was a gifted chemist in his youth, long before he became a titan of finance, and he still understood the science better than most of his employees. "I'm pulling the raw data logs from the spectrometry server myself," Finch said, his eyes glued to the screen. "Every run, every sample. If you cut a corner, Aris, If you buried a single anomalous result, I will find it." Thorne watched, his heart pounding against his ribs. He hadn't buried anything, not exactly. The initial screens had been perfect. But in his rush to finalize the data package for the investors, he had relied on a new automated analysis software to process the final, most exhaustive set of toxicology screenings. The summary report it generated had been glowing. He had never bothered to look at the raw, unprocessed spectrographs himself. It was a minor delegation, a matter of efficiency. It couldn't possibly matter. Finch found the project files. He located the folder labeled Herg Assay Final. He didn't look at the summary report. He opened a raw data file, a complex graph with dozens of peaks and valleys. His eyes scanned the data, his expression grim. The automated software was programmed to flag any peak above a 5% affinity threshold, Finch said, more to himself than to Thorne. "Standard procedure." He pointed to the screen. "And here is the peak for your primary molecule, 0.8%, well within safe limits." Thorne started to breathe a sigh of relief. "You see, Alistair, it's clean. The girl was crazy." Finch's face was stone. The software was testing for the molecule we asked for, the one with the correct stereochemistry. His fingers typed another command. But what if a small, seemingly insignificant batch of the wrong enantiomer was synthesized by mistake, a 1% impurity? Let's see what that looks like. He reran the analysis, but this time he instructed the software to look for the signature of the molecule the waitress had drawn on the napkin. For a few seconds, the screen was a blur of processing data. Thorne held his breath, and then it appeared. A tiny, almost invisible peak on the graph, previously lost in the background noise. It was small, but it was sharp, and it was undeniable. Finch zoomed in on it. The software calculated its binding affinity. The number that flashed on the screen was 78%. Catastrophic. The silence in the room was absolute. The screen glowed with the evidence of their near disaster. The 1% impurity, the wrong-handed molecule that Thorne had dismissed as statistically insignificant, was a ticking time bomb. The waitress had been right. Alistair Finch stared at the screen, at the glowing red number that spelled out his own ruin. He felt a wave of icy dread wash over him, followed immediately by a surge of white-hot fury. He had come within a pen stroke of betting his fund, his reputation, and the lives of future patients on a lie. An unintentional lie, perhaps, born of arrogance and haste, but a lie that would have destroyed him. He turned his head slowly, his gaze falling upon Aris Thorne. Thorne looked like he had seen a ghost. His face was ashen, his designer suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for him. The slick, confident veneer had been stripped away, leaving only a terrified, ambitious man who had flown too close to the sun. "Aris," Finch said, and his voice was terrifyingly calm, the eerie quiet at the center of a hurricane. "You didn't check the raw data, you just read the summary." Thorne couldn't speak. He just shook his head, a pathetic, jerky motion. "You saw the 99% purity result and you rushed it," Finch continued, piecing it together. "You wanted the glory for this deal so badly, you skipped the final, most fundamental step of verification. You took the machine's summary and presented it as gospel." "Alistair, I swear I didn't know," Thorne whispered, his voice cracking. It was a tiny impurity. An honest mistake. "An honest mistake?" Finch's voice rose, the calm finally shattering. "An honest mistake that would put a cardiotoxic drug into the market. An honest mistake that would have made my fund a synonym for lethal incompetence? You didn't just fail me, you fool. You almost destroyed everything I've ever built." He gestured wildly at the laptop. And the truth, the actual, life-saving truth was handed to me on a napkin by a waitress you wouldn't have spit on if she was on fire. The sheer, staggering irony of the situation hit Alistair with the force of a physical blow. He had been saved from his own hubris, from his chosen scientist's incompetence, by the most unlikely person in the universe. He felt a bizarre mix of profound relief and profound humiliation. Without another word to Thorne, he turned and walked back into the Roosevelt room. His entire demeanor had changed. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was now overshadowed by a grim, focused clarity. Mr. Ito and his associate looked up as he entered. "My sincerest apologies for the delay, Ito-san," Alistair said, his voice steady and controlled. He walked to the table, picked up the contract, and, in one decisive motion, tore it cleanly in half. Dr. Thorne, who had followed him out of the study, let out a strangled gasp. "There appears to have been a significant and, frankly, unforgivable error in the data presented to us tonight," Finch announced, letting the two halves of the contract fall to the table. "Pharmaxon's lead drug is unsafe. The deal is off." He then turned to Thorne, his eyes like shards of glass. "Aris, you are fired. Have your security badge and company credit cards on my desk by 9 a.m. If you are not out of the lab by noon, I will have you removed for trespassing. We are done." Mr. Ito looked from the torn contract to Finch's resolute face. He was no scientist, but he understood integrity, and he understood disaster averted. He rose from his chair and gave Alistair Finch a short, respectful bow. "A wise decision, Finch-san. You have saved us all a great deal of trouble." The deal was dead. But for Alistair Finch, the night's work was far from over. As the Japanese investors quietly gathered their things, Alistair's mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about a cheap ballpoint pen, a linen napkin, and a pair of dark, intelligent eyes that had seen the truth when everyone else, including himself, had been blind. He had to find that waitress. While fortunes were being unmade in the Roosevelt room, Maya Reyes was in the sterile, fluorescent-lit staff locker room, changing out of her uniform. Her hands still trembled, but her mind was strangely, eerily calm. She had done it. The consequences were no longer in her control. She fully expected the door to burst open and for security guards to escort her off the premises. She imagined Mr. Gable, his face purple with rage, telling her she'd never work in this city again. She methodically packed her meager belongings into her worn backpack, a worn biochemistry textbook, her wallet, a half-eaten granola bar, bracing for the inevitable impact. The door opened. Maya looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. But it wasn't security. It wasn't Mr. Gable. It was Alistair Finch. He stood in the doorway of the cramped locker room, a man who belonged in boardrooms and on the covers of magazines, looking utterly out of place amidst the rows of cheap metal lockers and discarded aprons. He had dismissed the cowering Dr. Thorne with a final, contemptuous glance, and had left his legal team to handle the fallout with the investors. His only priority was finding her. Maya stood frozen, her backpack clutched in her hand like a shield. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air crackled with unspoken questions. Finch's expression was unreadable, a complex mixture of gratitude, curiosity, and sheer, profound disbelief. He finally broke the silence. "They're going to name a wing of a hospital after you one day," he said, his voice devoid of its earlier harshness. "And no one will ever know it was you." Maya swallowed hard. "Is the deal?" "The deal is dead," he confirmed. "Because of you. You didn't just save me $150 million, you saved my fund. You saved my reputation. You may have saved thousands of lives." He took a step into the room. "I have to ask, How in God's name did you know? The question hung in the air. This was her moment to tell the truth, all of it. The dam of secrets she had maintained for 3 long years finally broke. I am a pre-med student, she said, her voice quiet but clear. I was at Columbia. My focus was pharmacology. She hesitated, then the rest came out in a rush. The drug your Dr. Thorne developed, the mechanism of action, it was similar to a new heart medication that was fast-tracked a few years ago. My father was in that trial. The drug had a flawed stereoisomer, just like yours. It caused irreversible cardiac scarring. It killed him. I've spent the last 3 years of my life studying every piece of research, every clinical data point related to that failure. When I saw the molecule on that screen, I recognized the mistake. It was the same mistake. Finch's eyes widened. It all clicked into place. The confidence, the precision, the impossible knowledge. It wasn't a lucky guess. It was expertise forged in the crucible of personal tragedy. Columbia, he said, a new level of respect in his tone. What happened? Why are you here? Maya looked away, the pain of her past welling up. He got sick. The legal fight to get the drug company to admit fault. It took everything. I had to drop out. I had to pay the bills. The simple, brutal explanation was all that was needed. Alistair Finch, a man who navigated the cutthroat world of high finance, was silenced by the stark reality of her sacrifice. He saw the ghost of the brilliant scientist standing before him in a cheap t-shirt and worn jeans, holding a backpack full of shattered dreams. He saw a mind that his company desperately needed, a mind that was currently scrubbing floors and clearing plates. The cosmic injustice of it was overwhelming. He had spent millions on consultants and expert analysts, and not one of them had seen what she saw in a single glance. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't about a reward. A check would be a profound insult to what she had done, to who she was. This was about correcting a fundamental error in the universe. I'm not going to offer you money, Miss Reyes, he said, his voice firm. Money can't fix this. I'm going to offer you a job. Maya looked up, stunned. A job? Not as a waitress in my corporate cafeteria, he said, a faint, wry smile touching his lips for the first time. I am dissolving Pharmaxon tomorrow morning and absorbing its assets into a new research entity under my direct control. The project is salvageable. The core idea is brilliant, but the execution was flawed. It needs to be rebuilt from the ground up by someone with integrity and a paranoid attention to detail. It needs you. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. I want you to join the new research team. Not as an assistant, as a lead consultant on this project. You won't be working for my R&D department. You'll be working with me to rebuild it. Maya stared at him, speechless. It was an impossible offer, a fantasy plucked from a life she had long since mourned. Her mind, so quick with formulas and equations, couldn't process this. I don't have a degree, she stammered. I dropped out. You have something far more important than a piece of paper, Finch countered, his gaze intense. You have the truth, and you have the courage to speak it. That's rarer than a PhD and a hell of a lot more valuable. He extended his hand. The job comes with a full scholarship to Columbia, effective immediately. You will finish your degree. You will go to medical school if you still want to. My foundation will cover every penny. Your only job is to get your life back. Tears welled in Maya's eyes, not of sadness or fear, but of a profound, earth-shattering relief. The crushing weight she had carried for 3 years began to lift. In that grimy locker room, surrounded by the remnants of her hardship, Maya Reyes reached out and took Alistair Finch's hand. She was done being invisible. The transition was not instantaneous. There was no magical movie montage where Maya swapped her apron for a lab coat and immediately solved the world's problems. Reality, as Alistair Finch had promised, was more complicated. Her first day was not in a gleaming laboratory, but in a sterile, windowless boardroom, sitting beside Finch as his lawyers dismantled Pharmaxon. She watched as a team of auditors, guided by her insights, sifted through Thorne's sloppy data, uncovering a pattern of rushed protocols and ignored anomalies. She was not a savior. She was a key witness, her tragic story now a crucial piece of evidence in a multi-million-dollar corporate autopsy. The first few weeks were a brutal immersion. The remaining Pharmaxon scientists, loyal to Thorne or simply terrified for their jobs, treated her with a mixture of suspicion and outright hostility. They saw a waitress, a dropout, who had somehow bewitched the new boss. They challenged her, questioned her, tried to bury her in jargon. But Finch was her shield. Miss Reyes saw what a dozen PhDs missed, he stated flatly in a team meeting, his voice silencing all dissent. Until you can demonstrate a similar level of insight, I suggest you listen to what she has to say. Her real work began not with beakers and test tubes, but with spreadsheets and data files. For hours every day, she sat with Finch and a small, trusted team, meticulously reanalyzing every stage of Cardia 7's development. It was grueling, unglamorous work, but for Maya, it was like breathing again after years of being underwater. She pointed out flaws in their synthesis process, identified weaknesses in their toxicology screens, and, using her deep knowledge of her father's case, predicted potential side effects the original team had never even considered. Simultaneously, she re-enrolled at Columbia. Walking onto that campus again was the hardest and most wonderful thing she had ever done. She was older than her classmates, her focus more intense, her presence in lectures charged with a purpose they couldn't possibly understand. She juggled a full course load with her consulting work for Finch, her days a blur of biochemistry lectures and late-night conference calls. The exhaustion was immense, but it was a different kind of tired. It was the satisfying ache of a life being rebuilt, not the soul-crushing fatigue of a life being endured. 6 months after that fateful night at the Argent Club, they had a breakthrough. Working with a brilliant but unheralded chemist on the team whom Thorne had consistently overlooked, Maya helped develop a new synthesis pathway. It didn't just eliminate the dangerous impurity, it produced a molecule that was 15% more effective at binding to its intended target. It was a better, safer, more elegant version of the drug. It was no longer Cardia 7. They called it Reyes 1, though Maya vehemently protested the name until Finch overruled her. The first preclinical trial results of the new compound came in a year later. They were flawless. The drug was potent, specific, and showed zero signs of the cardiotoxicity that had plagued its predecessor. Alistair Finch, reading the report in his office, with Maya sitting opposite him, did something she had never seen him do. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile of triumph and relief. "Your father would be proud, Maya," he said quietly. 2 years passed, not in a blur, but as a series of sharp, vivid moments of triumph. Maya graduated from Columbia, summa cum laude. The Reyes 1 drug, now officially named Cardian, entered human trials, performing beyond their wildest expectations. The Alistair Finch Foundation, with a new 9-figure endowment, announced the Elena Reyes Memorial Scholarship for promising but underprivileged pre-med students, named after Maya's mother. One crisp autumn evening, Alistair invited her to dinner. He didn't say where they were going. When the car pulled up, Maya felt a strange jolt of recognition. It was the Argent Club. The new Maître d' greeted Alistair by name and led them not to the main dining room, but directly to the private Roosevelt room. The table was set for two. It was the exact spot where her life had irrevocably changed. As she sat down, she saw Mr. Gable at the far end of the restaurant. He was no longer the manager, but a senior waiter, his posture stooped, his face etched with a permanent look of weary resentment. He saw her, and for a fleeting second, his eyes widened in disbelief before he quickly looked away, busying himself at another table. There was no triumph in it for Maya, only a quiet, sad acknowledgement of how different their paths had become. "I thought it was time to rewrite the memory of this room," Alistair said gently, unfolding his napkin. During dinner, they didn't talk about profit margins or FDA approvals. They talked about the future. Maya spoke passionately about her acceptance into Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Alistair spoke about his plans to build a new, non-profit research institute dedicated to ethical drug development, which he wanted her to help lead once she finished her residency. "You know," Alistair said, swirling a glass of wine, "not the 82 Petrus, but a more modest, excellent vintage." "I still have it." "Have what?" Maya asked. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, elegantly framed object. It was the original linen napkin from that night. Her frantic, powerful scrawl was preserved behind museum-quality glass. "I keep it on my desk," he said. "Whenever a team of experts tells me something is a sure thing, or a consultant presents a report that's too good to be true, I look at this. It reminds me that certainty is the enemy of truth. It reminds me that the most valuable person in the room might be the one serving the water." Maya looked at the artifact of her old life, a testament to her moment of impossible courage. She was no longer that desperate waitress, nor was she only the brilliant student. She was both. She was a woman forged in hardship who had reclaimed her own genius, not by magic, but by relentless work and unwavering integrity. Looking at Alistair across the table, she smiled, a genuine, radiant smile of a person who was finally, completely whole. The whisper in the dark had not just brought her into the light, it had forced her to build her own.